get really comfortable with failure. Because what ends up
Mm.
happening too is once you're on a path and it's going really well, you're like, oh, I'm checking all my boxes of all the things I wanted to accomplish. Then I'm just going to keep going down the line. I think it gets harder and harder to do something that might unravel those check boxes.
Colleen Cutcliffe, welcome to The Shift. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Colleen is first and foremost a remarkable woman. You are a scientist and you have a PhD in microbiology and biochemistry from Johns Hopkins. And now you are CEO. Well, I guess now it's been like 12 years, but you're CEO and co founder of Pendulum, which is a revolutionary company aimed at creating different probiotics that can help heal some of these ailments that come from unbalanced gut health, which is a very hot topic. It probably wasn't even as hot of a topic when you started, was it?
No, it's so funny because people are like, "How did you know this is gonna be trending?" And I feel like I had no idea. We just thought that the microbiome and gut health was super important, so we decided to try to create products here, and I didn't know that when we came out with products, it was gonna be a moment where everybody sort of realized how important gut health is for all of our health issues, so we got lucky.
I mean, you were really on the very early adopter side of this huge trend now, which is gut health. And I want to ask you about that. First, let's go back then to how you started Pendulum and kind of like your career journey thus far. I think people would be really interested in hearing that.
Sure. So, yeah, as you mentioned, my background is pretty hardcore science. So, I started by getting my PhD at Johns Hopkins in biochemistry and molecular biology. And then I did a pretty traditional postdoc at Northwestern. And then I made my way across the country out to the West Coast. I worked in the Bay Area in a pharmaceutical company. We were developing drugs for Parkinson's disease. And so I sort of learned how drug development works in pharma companies there. And then I did what everybody does in Silicon Valley. I joined a startup company. This was a DNA sequencing company. I was still running, biology and deep in science there. The company went through rapid growth. We went public. And so I really learned there, like, okay, what is it like to be part of a company that is scaling rapidly and then, goes public? And on the other side of that, started this company with really the intention of taking a lot of kind of academic research and DNA sequencing work that was, an innovation that was happening there, and applying it in the microbiome or in gut health, and trying to figure out, is there an opportunity to create new products and new, ways for people to improve their health? And so that's kind of how we got to where we are now.
I also read on your site that you do have an interesting story about how specifically gut health came about. You delivered your daughter prematurely and she was on several doses of antibiotics, and that really probably inspired you to create some solutions for how she could maintain a healthy gut.
I mean, it's one of those things where I don't know if you've ever bought a new car and then all of a sudden you see that car everywhere on the road. I sort of feel like I started reading all this stuff about the microbiome and about gut health, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, I know how this is affecting my life, and it really was through my daughter who was born almost 2 months prematurely, and the standard protocol is they live in intensive care. She was there for, the first month of her life, and they give them multiple doses of antibiotics, not because they have an infection or anything. They're just so fragile that they don't want them to get one. And this study came out while I was trying to understand, like, is there an opportunity in this space? And they looked at 12,000 babies, and they showed that babies who were on lots of antibiotics were more prone to diseases later on in life, like obesity and type 2 diabetes. And the Mayo Clinic actually repeated that study, and they showed that if you're under 2 years old and you're on lots of antibiotics, later on, you're not only more susceptible to obesity and, metabolic issues, but you're also more prone to things like ADHD, celiac disease, allergies, asthma. And so all of a sudden, I started to realize, like, oh my gosh, my kid who falls right in this group of getting all these antibiotics is set up for a life of potentially all these terrible chronic illnesses. So, we could start a company that could have the goal of helping millions of people, but it would also include my own daughter. And so that seemed like
Mm.
a no brainer to at least try.
Yeah, absolutely. I I feel like okay, so For those who are not scientists, do not have a PhD from Johns Hopkins, how would you describe gut health? And like basically like why should people care? And why should it be at the forefront of our minds and of our health?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, as you start to read more and more about gut health, you'll start to realize that one of the things that we're learning is that your gut is at the core of all your different health systems. And I sort of think about it like, I don't know if you remember when people started realizing, like in workouts, if you had like a really strong core, you could do anything. Like you could all of a sudden, run a marathon, or you could, you had like it really played out in all kinds of things that you might not expect in terms of your physical, strength and endurance. And so this is sort of the same thing where people are realizing like your gut health is at the core. And so when you have better gut health, you have a better immune system, you have better inflammatory responses, you have better digestion. And what we really been focused on is actually you have better metabolism. And so,
Interesting.
it is a really big opportunity to sort of transform your health. And the crazy thing is that a lot of people maybe don't even know that they're experiencing these things. And so, it's an opportunity to kind of improve something that maybe you don't even know. And like we've been really focused on metabolism and how our body metabolizes sugars and carbs and food cravings and how do we curb those naturally. And so, there's all these, we got a customer back who said to me, I've always had a sweet tooth. I've always been kind of like had these sugar cravings, and I've always been so weak when it comes to sugar. Don't put a cookie in front of me because it's going to be gone in 4 seconds. But that's just me. Like I just love sugar. And after being on our product, came back and said, you know what? Like that's actually not me. That was a biological part of my body that was telling me that I needed sugar. But after fixing my gut microbiome, I now don't have those cravings. And I realized that's not who I am. That's something that's happening in my body. And, my weaknesses are actually just something that was happening in my gut and could be changed. And so I think that's kind of the exciting part about the work we get to do.
Yeah, absolutely. This is like my one technical question, but now you have me very curious because there's the gut health on one side of it that's very talked about. And then there's also these glucose spikes that's very talked about. And we actually just had the glucose goddess on the show, and
Oh,
she
of
talked
course.
about all about, our body's response to glucose and regulating that. So, how do those work together then, or why are they dependent on each other? I know you have a probiotic that helps with glucose spikes.
Yeah, your question is basically the question that we asked 10 years ago when we
Ah,
started the company.
there we go.
How are these things related? And it turns out, really, really fundamentally, when you eat food, it gets metabolized by your gut microbiome. And if you are low or missing certain gut bacteria, your food just isn't metabolized properly. And you think about it like you eat food, and there's 100 trillion organisms in your body that are like a little manufacturing factory, and in that manufacturing factory, there's different departments, and each of them has a job to do. And one of these departments is responsible for making sure that your blood glucose spikes after you eat food don't spike out of control. And then also you recover from that. And so if you're missing that department, you're missing certain microbes in that department, you are not metabolizing your sugars as well as you could be. And so
Mm,
that's how those two things are related. So if you give your body back those specific gut strains, those bacterial strains or those specific probiotics, now your body, that department is, back in full swing, and you can metabolize sugars much better. And then you don't get these big sugar spikes. And that's how your sugar spikes, your glucose spikes, and the microbiome are just really tied to each other.
that is so fascinating. It's all I like you said, it's like the core, how you everything helps. If you have a strong core, it helps everything. And I do feel like gut health is this thing that we're finding just impacts every single aspect of our overall health. And finally, I guess, because we've been hurting from so many things and wondering like why they happen. So grateful to companies like yours that are helping us to finally understand that.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's really, I think, the revolution that's happening. Most people think of like, oh, I take probiotics because I have digestive issues. But what we're learning is it's not just digestive issues, it's even things
Yeah.
as fundamental as your metabolism. So it's an exciting, you can see, like, I can go on forever. It's an exciting.
If you are listening to this podcast, you are probably a fan of inspirational quotes. And if that's the case, then you should check out my book. I feel that it's a cute little retro book with each chapter being a different emotion, and then quotes that can help you with that emotion. So if you're looking to support me or the show, if you need a cute little gift for a friend or just something to flip through when you're feeling down one day, then this book is for you. You can purchase it at quotesbychristie.com, which is my website, or the link will be in the show notes. We will take a small turn and go back to definitely the scientific aspect of it, but also the point of the show. We love asking people, especially wonderfully accomplished people like yourself, what the best advice is they've ever gotten. So, Colleen, do you have a best piece of advice that you've ever gotten that you'd like to share? And maybe it's more personal, maybe it's more career related. We like it all.
I think probably the best piece of advice that I've gotten, I actually still carry in my, in my head today, was from my dad. And it was when I was um, finishing up my PhD. I was trying to decide what to do next, and I had a couple of job offers that were super exciting, for me. And then I also had a boyfriend who was moving to Chicago, and I just was really perseverating over, what to do. Like, do I follow this guy? Do I go take this like, glamorous job in New York City? Like, what should I do next? And I had so many conversations with my friends, my family about it. And at one point, I think my dad was probably sick of talking about it. He said, Look, the most important thing for you to keep in mind is that um, nothing is final. Like, let's say you move to Chicago and you guys end up breaking up. Like, so what? Then you can always go take that job in New York, or you can always go do something different, or maybe something else in Chicago will come to light. Like, this is not a be all end all decision that whatever you
Mhm.
do now, it's going to shape your entire future. So just like step back from the cliff. And I think that for me, that was really important advice, because sometimes these things happen to us, or we have these big decisions to make, and they weigh so heavily on us, and we just think, oh my gosh, if I make the wrong choice, it's going to like ruin me. And the truth is that life is dynamic and the landscape is always changing, and you roll with the punches and new opportunities show up that you weren't expecting. And so no decision is actually, so dramatic that it should kind of carry this weight for you. And I think lightening that load on that decision was important for me. And I continue to use that now when I get really stressed out, or I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? That little voice in my head is like, it's just not that big of a deal. Just make a decision and move forward.
I absolutely love that. It's so interesting because we had a guest a couple weeks back, Barb Schmidt, and we talked about this very same concept of how we ruminate so many hours and days and
Mhm.
years of our lives over, well, there's one right decision and there's one wrong decision. And I think most of life is not like that. There's just
Exactly.
decisions and what we do with them. I wonder if you had other times in your life where you had two decisions, maybe several, placed in front of you, and you thought this same concept of like, there's one right thing, there's one wrong thing. And what did you choose? And did it end up okay?
Well, in this particular case, that boyfriend is now my husband, and we have two children, and dogs, and all of that. So
Oh.
it worked out nicely. Um, I think another decision point was maybe like thinking about starting this company. So I will tell you that I went to a wedding of a really, really good friend of mine, and she's a photographer, and so there were a bunch of people at this wedding who were, um, in their early 20s, and they were models, and they kind of it was a it was eye-opening for me, because sometimes we forget how many opportunities, we once felt that we had. And I think for me, I felt that way. Like, at this point, I was married and I had kids and a mortgage, and all of this stuff. And what this did was like it put me back into that mindset of that I was in when I was, in college or just out of college, which is I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be exciting. I don't really
Yeah.
like, you just feel like you can do anything, and anything is an opportunity for you. And I it really inspired me to just quit my job that I was at and go start this
Mm.
company. Because I think there are all these things you perseverate about, and you think about like, oh, this could go wrong, and most startups fail, and oh my god, and it just sort of felt like, well, whatever. So then you start the company, it fails, like then I just go back and get a real job. So I think it's played out in really big decisions that I've made that have, maybe been hard to make, but this just made it easier.
I really love that concept of the fact that as we get older, I do feel like I don't know why. I think because as more responsibility comes upon us, maybe we just feel like we have less flexibility to really be creative or step out of that comfort zone. But do you have a piece of advice you would give to someone who maybe is in their more mature years who feels like they don't really have that option anymore? Like the world used to be their oyster and now it's just tiny and there's only one path that they can take.
Yeah, I think it comes back to this conversation that we're having about, no decision is immutable, and life is kind of a series of decisions. And by staying in what you're doing, you're making a decision. You're making a decision that I'm going to stay on this path and I'm not going to go try new things out. And I think the piece of advice is sort of, to proactively make decisions as opposed to kind of just continuing on with something because it happens to be the path that you're on. And probably the second half to that advice is to get really comfortable with failure. Because what ends up happening too is once you're on a path and it's going really well, you're like, oh, I'm checking all my boxes of all the things I wanted to accomplish. Then I'm just going to keep going down the line. I think it gets harder and harder to do something that might unravel those check boxes. And so, for example, if you've got a career and you're like, oh, my goal is to one day be a, director of blah, 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 and you're like, can see that trajectory in your current job, it might be really hard to quit that and go do something else where you're like, oh, well, maybe I won't be on that path anymore. So I think getting comfortable with failure and like it might not work out is the other part to that, being able to try something new.
How did you overcome that? I always find that fascinating when people start their own companies and you just like dove right in. I mean, this is like a big idea that you had that you started. How did you overcome like you were talking about this intense fear of failing or of it not working out?
Yeah, I think for me, it's always been sort of, cranial, like, oh, I know the stats. I know that most startups don't work out. And in some ways you can, let your emotions, take over. I don't think I really was scared of failure when we started this company because I guess I sort of assumed like it's probably going to fail. Like, look at all these stats. My company fails. I'm just like everybody else. So
Yeah.
there's no real pressure to be a successful startup because most fail. So I think I didn't worry about failure and what are people going to think. I think pretty much I thought it would fail.
Yeah. Well, and then I guess then you don't have to be disappointed. I mean, you shouldn't expect the worst, but it's not bad to be kind of realistic about things because you would just be in the same boat as a lot of other people. It's no reflection on you.
Yeah, and at the very least, it would be a new experience, and I think that was actually what was driving me, and that's where, like, that wedding and all those guests really inspired me. It was like, "Well, I wanna do something new, I wanna learn something new and experience something new," and even if the company fails, what would be successful for me is I got to experience something new, and so for me, it felt like it was gonna work out, it was gonna be successful no matter what actually happened to the company.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have the biggest lesson that you've learned thus far from starting this company and from the trials of a startup?
I think the it's there's sort of 2 big things that happen when you're a startup that don't really happen that never happened to me in any other job I had. One is that things really do change constantly at a very fast pace and in very dramatic ways. So life, of course, is always changing, but it maybe like kind of changes, like this. And when you're in a startup, it's like you're living like this, things are going up and you're like on a roller coaster that's much faster than normal change, and the change is bigger than in regular real life. So I think getting comfortable with that and becoming a little bit immune to it is important because if you ride that super high, super low, super high, super low, like you're going to go crazy. So you kind of have to modulate everything, in a very deliberate way, not get too fired up about any one thing. Um, and the second thing is that if you love learning, like you really love learning new things, you got to go to a startup because you will
Mm.
just learn more than you could ever learn from, books or classes or other people because you're just in it. And as you grow in a startup, you're just constantly having to learn new things. So if you like learning, startup's the place for you.
I love that. How do you feel like you've applied I feel like both of those things are very applicable to parenthood, to relationships. How do you feel like you've taken those lessons from building this company, and how have they seeped into your personal life?
Well, I think if anybody has kids, you kind of know your first kid is always your guinea pig kid, and the second kid you do much better with. And so I think it really does come back to this, which is with the first kid, you worry about every little thing. You're like, oh my gosh, are they walking at the right time? Are they eating the right foods? Is this the right food for them to be eating now? And did they smile at me? Or what are my friends doing? Are we on track? And you just like perseverate over, every little thing that that kid is doing. That poor kid is just an infant, a toddler, they're just doing their thing. And I think by the time you get to your second kid, you sort of feel like everybody learns to walk at some point. So it doesn't really matter whether this kid learns, at this month or that month. And so I think, that is part of that like up and down with your first baby that you maybe aren't so good at modulating, and you get your second one, your third one, you get a little bit better at not getting too fired up about every little thing day to day.
That's good to hear. I'm expecting my first in
Oh,
2 months now.
congratulations.
And, so I'm trying to get all the parenting tips I can, and honestly, no one has disappointed me. I feel like all the seasoned mothers just know exactly what to say to calm you down.
Oh, well, it's just a whole new world. I mean, talking about loving to learn, you're just gonna, there's so much to learn. And so it can be overwhelming. I remember like how many bottles we tried and tested and went through.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, we should get glass bottles because I don't want my baby to be exposed to plastics. And like, that's so bad for them. And so we got these glass bottles, and we had a nanny because both my husband and I are working full time. And she was just like, we'll use the glass bottles, but I just wanna let you know that this is gonna be terrible because babies drop their bottles literally all the time, and these are gonna break, and they're gonna shatter everywhere, and so we were like, "Well, let's just try them," and sure enough, like, 1 week later, all 5 bottles were gone, and so, just it's just the lesson.
You learn as you go, and like you said,
Yeah,
I think you have to have a lot of grace with yourself with the first is kind of the theme that I'm getting from a lot of the advice.
exactly, exactly, but it's such an exciting time and, congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I I also would love to know how you balanced motherhood with starting this company. It's been like 12 years. Pendulum started in 2012, right?
Mhm.
So, 12 years starting this big endeavor. You have co-founders and people who have helped you along, but this has really been your baby and while having other babies. So, how have you balanced that? And I mean, what tips would you give to other people to balance that?
Well, first of all, I had, 2 co-founders makes a huge difference. That means all the work is
Yeah.
divided, I have a third of the work. And so that is huge. But I think a lot of it kind of, for me, happened before even having children, which is kind of just deciding what matters to you and actually writing it down. And it doesn't need to be like this comprehensive long list, but it's like, what are the 3 most important things to you? And that might change over time. But, if for me, it was, family was always, very much in the top 3. And you have a rank order of those things. And that becomes your guiding compass for everything that you do. And so if you have, and it's different for everybody. And like I said, it can change over time for you, but literally writing down these are the things that are the most important to me and the order of them, and using that every minute, every hour, every day, that becomes your compass for decision making. And so for me, for example, when my children were younger and I needed to take them to school and pick them up, it was really important to me to be able to do drop off. And so I was like, I'm not going to go to work until after drop off. So I'm not going to show up until, whatever, 8:30 or 9. But I like my career is also really important to me. And so I'm going to work a full day. I like oftentimes, even now, like I don't really do lunch. I eat while I'm working because I want to be as efficient as possible while I'm at work because there's a cutoff. Now my kids are older, so it's sort of the opposite. They get themselves to school, but I want to be home every night for dinner and really be there. So if you work with me, you know that come 6 o'clock, you're not gonna hear from me for the rest of the night unless you've got a fire and you're gonna call me or text me,
Mm.
like, that's it. There's no more work gonna happen. That's my family time, and so and it's easy to once you have those rules in place, it becomes really easy to, stick with them because you've made a promise to yourself and these things that are important to you. So when I started the company, I had this, like, 6 p.m. rule, and I'm an early morning person, so I start my day early. I work all day long, like a mad person, and then at 6 o'clock, I'm done. I'm clocking out. I was already doing that before we started this company, so I've just continued it. But I do think people oftentimes, we say, "Oh, this is really important to me." but we don't live in a way that matches that. And that's why I say writing it down can actually make a big difference because it almost feels more permanent when you've written it down.
Absolutely. I love that too because I think sometimes with just the mundane day to day, we forget about the things that actually matter. And like you said, even writing down 3 things, when it all boils down to it, usually that list is not very long. Like the things that really, really matter is a pretty short list. And yet throughout our day, we convince ourselves that there's 100 million other things that matter just as much.
Absolutely. And when you think about or when you listen to people and, kind of what did you regret most or what have you regretted, it's not sticking to that thing that you said was the most important to you. And so
Yeah.
nobody ever regret I mean, this is a terrible thing to say, but like nobody's ever like, "Oh man, I wish I worked more hours and spent less time with my family." Like never have you
So
ever heard
true.
anybody have that regret. And so, try to avoid that by actually sticking with what you say is important.
Yeah. And I think to your point, you can start that before you have a family, before you get married, before you make whatever big life decision you want to make. If you have those priorities in place, every small decision you make, I feel like then will fulfill those bigger priorities and those bigger goals that you have. But it's about setting them early on.
Totally, totally. And before I was even married, I had dogs. Like I'm a huge dog lover. And so the dogs set my dogs are like at the top of the list. So
Yeah.
got to take the dogs on a morning walk. They got to go on an evening walk. Like this is the schedule. It's the most important thing to me to never miss those. And so, I think you can set those anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really beautiful advice and honestly something I think you could do at any point in your life and it would probably help give your life some good trajectory if you're missing that. So everyone take note. I love asking people as well, as you know, point of this show, we don't want to keep you too long, but we also love quotes. And so do you have a favorite quote, a favorite mantra? Maybe it's an affirmation, but just something that has stuck with you. Maybe it's just sticking with you right now or it's been a long time favorite.
I think the quote or the mantra that probably shaped a lot of stuff that I do and how I work is it's all about the team. And let me explain what
Mm,
that means. When we first started our company and you go pitch to these venture capitalists, they'll tell you like, "Oh, these are the most important things like for me to invest in a company." And one of them is always the team. And so they'll often say like, "Oh, the idea is great, but like is this the team that's going to execute on it?" Or the idea is okay, but this team is amazing. And so they would always say it's all about the team, it's all about the team. And so honestly, when they would reject you, it was like a very clear, it's not your idea, it's you. It's like it's all about the
mm.
team. You're the team. And so that can be a little bit like hard on the ego. But this mantra that it's all about the team, we've kept that in our company, which is it's not about, an individual contributor who is, like, the most brilliant mind you'll ever meet. It's not about, you off there doing something, on your own that's groundbreaking. It's all about the team, the people who are here coming together to march towards a common mission and vision. And it extends outside of what I learned, is it extends outside of just work. It's also about the team that you have in your personal life. Who are your friends? Who is your network? Who are the people that you come to when things go wrong? Because things will go wrong. Like life is never, all peaches and sunshine. So, who are your people? Who is your team that you go to that supports you in bad times and celebrates with you in good times? It's all about the team and that community, both at work and at home. And so that's a mantra. It matters who that team, who your team is.
I couldn't have thought of a more beautiful way to leave off the conversation. I really love that, and I think it's so applicable in everyone's lives. I think sometimes we convince ourselves that we can do it alone, and I think people who have achieved any sort of success recognize that that is not the case. It's about the people that you have supporting you and helping you along, and those people really are what I feel like get you from point A to point B throughout your entire life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and if anybody out there is listening and you want to become part of the Pendulum team, feel free to reach out.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so that was my next wrap up is where can people go to learn more about Pendulum, to buy your amazing products? Clearly, Colleen is very experienced and has a lot of expertise in this, and her products are science backed and medically backed and not fluff influencer products in any way, shape, or form. So, where can people go to support you, and what do you want to tell us about Pendulum?
Well, the mission of Pendulum has always been to help millions of people improve their health through the microbiome or through the gut. And so if you go to our website, pendulumlife.com, we have a bunch of information in there about your gut and gut health and what you might be experiencing or missing, and then a lineup of products that can become part of your tool set to help you really with your metabolism and your gut health. So we're really focused on metabolism. And so I'd encourage everybody, go check out pendulumlife.com. We have an amazing team. Speaking of team, we have an amazing team of people that can answer any questions that you have. Please reach out. We love interacting with people. We love hearing stories about what's working, what's not working. That's how we get better. And so, really encourage anybody who's listening to go learn more and hopefully trial some of our products to see if they work for you. And we have open positions, so love to bring in passionate people who want to join the movement.
Well, beautiful. Well, Colleen, thank you again so much for taking the time from your busy schedule, from revolutionizing gut microbiome, to come and share your wisdom with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me and sharing all this out.
Thank you for tuning into The Shift. Don't forget to let us know what you think about this episode, and we will see you next time. Thanks.